Welcome to Don't Turn Off the Lights. Tonight we have a special recommendation for you. Find a quiet spot, dim the lights, put on your headphones, and make sure you're alone. Because tonight we're sharing 3 creepy stories about being home alone. Are you ready to feel the chills down your spine? Let's begin. Story 1. Noises in the house. I always enjoyed being home alone. My parents trusted me enough to leave me by myself whenever they went out of town, and I relished the freedom it brought. It was a Friday night, and they had gone to visit my grandparents for the weekend. I had the entire house to myself, and I was looking forward to binge-watching my favorite shows and eating junk food. It was around 8 p.m. when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. I turned on all the lights in the living room, creating a warm cocoon of light against the encroaching night. I settled on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in hand, and began my marathon. About an hour into my show, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like a soft thud, like something had fallen. I paused the show and listened, straining to hear anything else. The house was old and creaky, so I dismissed it as the building settling or perhaps something toppling over in my room. I resumed my show, trying to ignore the prickling feeling at the back of my neck. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time louder and more distinct. It was a definite thump, followed by what sounded like a dragging noise. My heart started to race. I muted the TV and sat in silence, listening intently. The noise continued, a slow, deliberate dragging sound coming from directly above me. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend, Mark. "Hey, you up? Something's making noises in my house," he replied almost immediately. "Probably just the wind or the house settling. Don't freak out." I wanted to believe him, but the sounds were too deliberate, too intentional to be anything but someone moving around. I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I made my way to the stairs. The house seemed to breathe around me, every creak and groan amplified in the silence. As I ascended the stairs, the dragging noise grew louder. It was coming from my parents' bedroom. I reached the top step and hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the room. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar space. Nothing seemed out of place. I stepped inside, scanning the room. The dragging sound had stopped. I moved the light across the floor, checking for anything that might have fallen or been moved. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black except for the narrow beam of the flashlight. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in as I banged on the door, shouting for help. But I knew no one could hear me. My nearest neighbors were too far away. I forced myself to calm down and think. I moved the flashlight around the room, searching for another way out. That's when I saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, moving toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it inch closer. It was a dark, amorphous shape, almost human-like but lacking any distinct features. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its form shifting and writhing. I backed away, pressing myself against the door. The thing seemed to stare at me, though it had no eyes. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as it extended a shadowy appendage toward me. I screamed and swung the flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadow. The figure recoiled, and the light passed through it, causing it to dissipate for a moment before reforming. I knew I couldn't stay in the room any longer. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw my shoulder against the door. It gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. My only thought was to get out of the house. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to open it and burst outside, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of water. I ran to the end of the driveway, gasping for breath, and called Mark. "Mark, you have to come over now. There's something in my house," I said, my voice trembling. He must have heard the panic in my voice because he didn't argue. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Stay outside." I hung up and paced back and forth, my eyes never leaving the house. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that shadowy figure peering out at me. True to his word, Mark arrived in 5 minutes, skidding to a stop in front of my house. He got out of the car and hurried over to me. "What's going on?" he asked, looking genuinely concerned. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words tumbled out in a jumbled mess. He listened patiently, then grabbed a flashlight from his car. "Stay here," he said, and headed toward the house. "Wait, don't go in there," I called after him, but he was already at the front door. I watched as he disappeared inside, the door closing behind him. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house, my heart pounding. Finally, Mark reappeared at the door, looking confused. "I checked the whole place. There's nothing in there," he said, walking back to me. "But I saw it," I insisted. "I heard it." He put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Maybe it was just your imagination. The mind can play tricks on you when you're alone." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of that shadowy figure was too vivid. Reluctantly, I followed him back into the house. We checked every room together, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Eventually, Mark convinced me to stay at his place for the night. As I gathered a few things, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back at the house one last time before we drove away, the windows dark and foreboding. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the shadowy figure and the eerie sounds. The next morning, I returned home, hoping that the daylight would banish the fear. But even in the bright sun, the house felt different, colder, and less inviting. I never told my parents what happened that night. They would have just laughed it off or told me I was imagining things. But every time I'm home alone, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting in the shadows. And every now and then, I hear that dragging noise, faint but unmistakable, reminding me that I'm never truly alone. Story 2, The Basement Door. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My parents were away on a business trip and I had the house to myself. At 16, I was no stranger to being left alone. I actually enjoyed the solitude. I had planned to spend the weekend catching up on homework, playing video games, and maybe inviting a couple of friends over. But everything changed when I heard the knock. It was Friday evening, and I was sprawled out on the couch, engrossed in a horror movie. I liked the adrenaline rush from these movies, the way they made my heart race. Little did I know that real fear was waiting just around the corner. A loud knock echoed through the house. I paused the movie, listening intently. The knock came again, more insistent this time. It wasn't coming from the front door. Confused, I muted the TV and followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The knocking was coming from the basement door. The basement in our house was a creepy place. It was unfinished, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten items. My parents kept it locked, and I rarely had a reason to go down there. But tonight, someone, or something, was on the other side of that door, demanding attention. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just another loud knock. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sound. For a moment there was nothing, then a faint whisper, "Let me in." I jumped back, my blood running cold. This had to be a prank. Maybe one of my friends had somehow gotten into the basement to scare me. But how? The basement door was always locked, and the windows down there were too small for anyone to crawl through. Summoning my courage, I reached for the doorknob. It was icy cold, and when I turned it, I realized the door was unlocked. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly pulled it open. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, the single light bulb at the top of the stairs barely illuminating the descent. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing down the stairwell. Silence. I flicked the light switch. but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. I cursed under my breath and grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, I slowly descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously. The basement smelled damp and musty, and the air was much colder than the rest of the house. I reached the bottom and swept the flashlight around, illuminating stacks of old boxes and dusty furniture. "Is anyone there?" I asked again, my voice trembling. The only sound was the drip of water from a leaky pipe. I took a few steps forward, the flashlight flickering slightly. I reached the center of the basement, my breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into darkness. I spun around, my heart racing, and pointed the flashlight back at the stairs. The door was closed, and I was alone. A whisper came from behind me, so close it felt like someone was right next to my ear. "Let me in!" I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting through the darkness. There was no one there. Panic set in, and I backed up against the wall, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. I pinched myself, hoping to wake up, but the pain confirmed my worst fear. I was wide awake. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the basement. "Let me in!" I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. I dialed my friend Sarah's number, praying she would pick up. The phone rang once, twice, and then she answered. "Hey, what's up?" she said, sounding cheerful. "Sarah, you have to come over. There's something in my basement," I whispered frantically. "What? Are you serious? Please, just hurry," I pleaded. Okay, I'm on my way," she said, hanging up. I tried to keep the flashlight steady, my eyes darting around the basement. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for Sarah. The whispers continued, growing more insistent. "Let me in! Let me in!" Finally, I heard a car pull up outside. The basement door opened, and I saw Sarah's silhouette at the top of the stairs. "Emily, are you down there?" she called out. "Yes, hurry!" I cried, relief washing over me. She descended the stairs quickly, her flashlight illuminating the way. "What's going on?" she asked, looking around the basement. "There's something down here. I heard whispers," I explained, my voice shaking. Sarah gave me a skeptical look, but didn't say anything. Together we searched the basement, moving boxes and checking every corner. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of anyone else. "Maybe it was just your imagination," Sarah suggested, trying to sound reassuring. I wanted to believe her, but the whispers had felt too real. We went back upstairs and I locked the basement door, hoping that would be the end of it. That night, Sarah stayed over and we camped out in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with movies and snacks. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, just as we were starting to relax, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more aggressive. We both froze, staring at the basement door. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking continued, each bang echoing through the house. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight and motioned for Sarah to follow me. We approached the door together, the knocking growing louder with each step. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. I reached for the doorknob, and just as my fingers touched the cold metal, a voice whispered from the other side, clear and chilling. "Let me in." I yanked my hand back, staring at the door in horror. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. We ran out of the house, not stopping until we reached her car. We drove to her place, and I spent the rest of the night wide awake, the whispers replaying in my mind. The next morning, we returned to my house, dreading what we might find. The basement door was ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just passed through. My parents never believed my story, dismissing it as a figment of my imagination. But I know what I heard, and every time I'm home alone, I can still feel it, waiting just beyond the door, whispering in the dark. Let me in. The glitch in the reflection. Sarah always enjoyed the quiet when her parents were away. Their weekend trip to the countryside left her with 2 whole days of uninterrupted solitude, a rarity in her busy household. She planned to catch up on some reading, maybe binge a new series, and indulge in some well-deserved relaxation. Friday evening settled over the neighborhood, the sun sinking below the horizon and casting long shadows through the windows. Sarah lit a few candles, enjoying the soft, flickering light as she prepared for a quiet night in. She filled the bathtub with warm water and lavender-scented bubbles, seeking comfort in the serene atmosphere she had created. As she soaked, she noticed something odd about the mirror on the wall opposite the tub. The glass, fogged up from the steam, seemed to have a dark spot in the center, a small blemish she had never seen before. She squinted at it, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It looked almost like a smudge, or perhaps a trick of the light. She dismissed it, leaning back and closing her eyes. After her bath, Sarah wrapped herself in a plush robe and wiped the steam from the mirror, revealing her reflection. She smiled at herself, running a hand through her wet hair. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. Her reflection, just for a moment, seemed to lag behind her movements, as if it were a video buffering. She shook her head, chalking it up to her tired eyes playing tricks on her. She returned to her room, ready to curl up with a good book. But the nagging feeling of being watched followed her, a cold prickle at the back of her neck. She glanced at the mirrors as she passed, half expecting to see something out of place. The night deepened and the house grew quieter. The only sounds were the occasional creaks and groans of the old structure settling. Sarah nestled into her bed, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting comforting shadows around the room. She lost herself in her book, the story captivating enough to distract her from her earlier unease. Hours passed, and the clock struck midnight. Sarah yawned, her eyes heavy with sleep. She placed the book on her nightstand and reached to turn off the lamp. Just as her hand touched the switch, she froze. The mirror on the opposite wall caught her eye. Her reflection was staring back at her, but something was wrong. The figure in the mirror wore a twisted, malevolent grin, one that did not match her own tired expression. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared, unable to look away. The reflection moved, raising a hand to wave slowly. Sarah's own hand stayed still, gripping the edge of the nightstand. Fear surged through her, and she leapt from the bed, backing away from the mirror. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection's grin widened, and it mouthed something she couldn't hear. The room grew colder, the chill seeping into her bones. She grabbed her phone, intending to call someone, anyone, for help, but the screen was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. Desperation clawed at her as she backed out of the room, her eyes never leaving the mirror. She fled down the hallway to the living room, where the largest mirror in the house hung above the fireplace. The reflection was waiting for her, standing in the middle of the glass, its eyes following her every move. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she edged around the room, avoiding the mirror's gaze. She grabbed a blanket and draped it over the glass, but the sense of being watched persisted. Every reflective surface seemed to hold a pair of eyes, staring, unblinking. She sank onto the couch, wrapping herself in another blanket, trying to calm her racing heart. The house was silent, but the silence was oppressive, filled with a weight she couldn't explain. She closed her eyes, willing herself to believe it was all in her head. A soft tapping broke the silence. Her eyes snapped open, and she looked toward the covered mirror. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She stood, every muscle in her body tense, and approached the mirror. With trembling hands, she pulled the blanket away. The reflection was gone. Relief flooded her for a moment, but it was short-lived. The tapping resumed, this time from the bathroom. She crept down the hall, the sound growing louder with each step. She reached the bathroom door and pushed it open, the mirror coming into view. Her reflection was there, its face twisted in anger now, fists pounding against the glass. Sarah stepped back, horrified, as the figure seemed to press against the mirror, its features distorting as if trying to break free. The tapping turned into a deafening pounding, the glass rattling in its frame. "Let me out," the reflection mouthed, its eyes burning with fury. Sarah stumbled back, tripping over the rug and falling to the floor. The reflection's pounding grew more frantic, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface of the mirror. She scrambled to her feet, terror driving her to action. She grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror, muffling the sound. She ran back to her room, slamming the door behind her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She huddled in a corner, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding the mirrors. She had to get out of the house. Gathering her courage, she grabbed her keys and dashed for the front door. Just as she reached it, a voice whispered from behind her, chilling her to the core. "Leaving so soon?" She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The reflection was standing in the hallway mirror, free of the glass. It smiled, a cold, malevolent expression that sent shivers down her spine. Sarah's scream echoed through the empty house as darkness closed in around her. The reflection stepped forward, merging with the shadows, and everything went black. When her parents returned on Sunday, they found the house eerily silent. Sarah was gone, no trace of her remaining. The mirrors, however, seemed clearer, sharper than before, and if they looked closely, they could almost see a shadow in the depths, a twisted smile lingering just beyond the surface. Thank you for joining us tonight. Remember, in the darkness, you are never truly alone. Subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Stay tuned and keep the lights on.